Alrighty, looks like we're closing the doors, so let's kick it off. How's everybody doing today on the final day of GCAP? We're good? I'm shocked that people showed up, so thank you all for coming very much. I appreciate it. I'd like to welcome you all to When Keeping It Real Goes Right. This is a guide to community management and genuine engagement. My name is Aaron Haukedal. The idea of the talk is kind of be high-level community management, but digging a bit deeper into actual genuine engagement. Kelsey, if you're at her talk yesterday, she did cover some of this, so that we'll be going over a bit of that, so I apologize. But yeah, like I said, today's goal is to really dig down into genuine engagement with your player base. 40 minutes isn't a lot of time, so I'm just going to go ahead and kick off. A little bit about me. My name is Aaron Haukedal. Most importantly, that little guy you're seeing right there, that's Noodle. That's my dog. He's more important on the slide than I am, so that's Noodle. Brief bit of my history. When I graduated high school, my mom said, "Get a job, you bum." So I ended up working in a kitchen, and that turned into a decade-long career as a chef. That doesn't specifically apply to this, but what it did teach me, it taught me a lot about community and camaraderie and the feedback loop. And that feedback loop of, we have a problem, how are we going to solve it, and then coming up with a solution and implementing that solution. The problem with kitchens in the hospitality industry is that they are equally, if not more toxic than Steam forums. So I had to get out of there while I still could. I have no actual technical skills, but I do love games, so I'm sure like a lot of us, that's how I ended up in marketing and communications. My first job in the games industry was the community manager at New World Interactive. So they're mostly known for a game called Insurgency Sandstorm. And then about a year and a half ago, I moved back to Australia with my wife, and I now work for Mod.io as the social and content strategist. For those of you who don't know what Mod.io is, if you've ever played a game like Deep Rock Galactic or SnowRunner, right on the main page, built into the game's UI itself, they have a mods button, and we power that. So we enable studios to implement mods and UGC directly in-game. And we do that cross-platform. So it's not, mods aren't just for PC anymore. We're bringing that across platform. So what is community management today? It's a very broad topic, but I think number one and most importantly, to me anyways, the core and heart of being a community manager is building relationships with your players. It's building trust, it's building connections with your players, and in turn, turning them into advocates and evangelists for your game. When you have that player base, the flip side of that coin is advocating for those players. You take their feedback when it's reasonable, and you're giving that information to your studio to try and action the feedback where it's reasonable. So it's essentially, you're a conduit between the studio and the player base. The downside sometimes of being that conduit is you're also acting as a firewall, and that can be a bit tough as a community manager. Like you're getting a lot of negative feedback from time to time, and that can be disheartening or tough to say the least. It's obviously never limited to that though. Like that's the high level of what a community manager should be doing, but it can and will very often also include posting on social media. I think that's a given. Engaging and moderating, whether that be Steam forums, publisher forums, Twitch streams, writing blog posts and patch notes, graphic design. All community managers end up doing graphic design at some point. It's part of the JD, right? You probably end up doing video production, whether that's trailers for your game, whether that's short form video for TikTok or Instagram. It's live streaming a lot of the time. It's often high level marketing strategy, which you don't really expect to be doing when you're a community manager, but you do often end up doing high level marketing strategy as well. And a favorite part for a lot of us community managers is the crisis communications. Something goes wrong, you're that first line of defense between players and the studio, and you have to put out those fires. Things that I just ran out of room for are creating and hosting events. For smaller studios, you might be creating bug reports yourself. You might be pitching ideas. And sometimes, you might be play testing, you might be level testing, and even doing QA work from time to time. It's often anything that production and development doesn't have the capacity to do will fall into the bucket of community management. So why does it matter? Why is community management important? Again, to me, number one, it's still building trust and connections and bonds with your player base and turning those into advocates for your game and in the long term for your studio. The problem with this, that can be a hard sell to leadership in your studio, and a lot has changed over the past decade. Live service games are everywhere. The big games, the Destinies, the Apex, the Fortnites, they've kind of shifted the tides on what game development looks like nowadays. And because of that, smaller games that aren't actually live service games still need to have a roadmap. They still need to have a, plan out scheduled content releases. And because of these two things, players have a level of entitlement or expectation, depending on who you're talking to. Realistically, it's entitlement, but that's just between us. And of course, we have to track sentiment and feedback. Game studios need to know how their players feel about their game and what they want to see. So, is this good or bad? Yes, it is. I want to kind of dig into the how and the why of the both sides. I think at the end of the day, it all evens out in the wash. Kind of the bad part of it. Does it involve more resources from studio? Yes, it does, because someone needs to be doing this work. But on the flip side of that coin, the good parts. It gives you a better understanding of your players. What kind of content do they want to see? Is it cross-platform mods in UGC? It's probably cross-platform mods in UGC. I should talk to Aaron later about cross-platform mods in UGC. But realistically, it's, do they want new levels? Do they want you to focus on quality of life improvements? Do they want you to focus on optimization? What do they dislike? You'll hear this a lot. This is not hard to gather what they don't like. You'll hear about that a lot. But taking this information, this feedback, can help inform and steer future production decisions. Obviously, not all feedback is equal, and you don't want to base your decisions entirely off of what your players are saying, but it can help you, gain some insight into what they want to see and what could be produced down the line. I think it helps remind players that it's people in this room that make games. They sit down and they play a game. Oftentimes, they don't realize that there are human beings on the other side that are putting their blood, sweat, and tears into making the games that they like. And I think that that's very important. But again, to me, number one, most important core and heart of community management is building connections and trust, and it's transforming players into advocates for your game. Short term, you're building advocates for your game, but the long tail of that is you're building advocates and evangelists for your whole studio. I think Bungie is a great example of that. They worked on Halo for a very long time. They announced Destiny. Destiny had a massive player base before anyone really even knew what it was. And that's because Bungie did a great job creating a very healthy, relatively inclusive, but happy community. So when Destiny came out, they already had a player base. So I think one thing that we fail to talk about often is you're not only building advocates for your game, but in the long term, you're building advocates for your whole studio. So you might be sitting here asking yourself, why am I in this room? I knew all this already. A lot of us are community managers or we work with community managers. How do I actually take this information and how do I succeed and how do I do it authentically? And I think to do that, this is kind of the MVP of achieving what you want to do. You want to define and understand kind of four main things. Number one, identify your player base. A hyper-casual mobile game, an RTS, a first-person shooter, they're all going to have a different player base, right? Like, they're going to engage with different things. So you need to know your player base. That's pretty straightforward. 2, you need to define and understand your voice. To be authentic and to succeed with genuine engagement, you need to bring and use your own tone. 3, the platforms where you decide to actually focus your efforts for your audience. And 4, the strategy. Try new things, throw spaghetti at walls, but make sure to notice which walls that spaghetti actually sticks to. So 2, 3, and 4 here we'll dig into a bit further. But number 1, your player base, and that's pretty self-explanatory. So after you know your player base, to me, the utmost importance is defining your tone and your voice. How do you want to sound? I do want to mention your player base can help influence your tone, but at the end of the day, you and your studio have to decide that yourselves, because it has to be one that you can authentically live in, right? Like, you're writing the tweets, you're writing the blog posts, and I think players can tell if you're not being honest, if you're not writing, from your own voice. So I think that's very important. When it comes to tone and voice, I think there's kind of 3 main decisions you have to make. The first is the spectrum between funny and serious. So I've got some examples here. Funny, it's Inner Sloth, it's Among Us, it's Victoria Tran, the community manager is community manager. We all know what they're doing. It's fantastic. It pretty much always hits, and they do a fantastic job. Somewhere in the middle, first-party platform, here's your games. All right, fair enough. And then more on the serious end, we have something like Bandai Namco with Elden Ring, the full moon witch and red-haired champion united there betwixt their warring homelands. That's really serious. Like, they're not really aiming for funny. But I think the first step is kind of deciding where on the spectrum you want to land. The second is the spectrum of casual to formal. Excuse me. So casual, I've got Metal Hellsinger here. They're pretty relaxed language. They're borderline cursing, which a lot of studios don't actually like. And they have a pun based on Despacito, which is pretty much as casual as you can get. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm using CD Projekt Red. So fairly formal, lots of proper nouns. They're referring to in-game content for the most part. And I want to mention that often the size of the player base or the studio can impact this. There's obviously exceptions. Again, Among Us has a huge player base. They are not formal at all, and I think that's fantastic. But it tends to be the larger the studio and the larger the player base, the more formal you end up. The third and final of the decisions you have to make is the spectrum between irreverent and respectful. Now, this isn't to say that irreverent necessarily means disrespectful, but those are just the words I chose, so sorry, you have to live with it. On the irreverent side, Cult of the Lamb, fantastic. You can see, obviously, because they've done such a good job defining that tone and sticking with it, they can reply to a tweet by saying, like, damn, for real? And that's it. And because they live in that tone, their player base knows how to perceive those tweets. There's always a risk if you're performing on the irreverent side of the spectrum that people will misunderstand what you're trying to achieve and it'll come across wrong, so do keep that in mind. Definitely know your base. And on the other side, we have respectful. So I've got a tweet from Humankind here. Some guy is complaining about a problem, and they're just saying, if that's your problem, here's the solution. Thumbs up. That's it. Easy. Respectful. So now you have your voice. You've defined how you want to speak to your players, but how are you going to actually use that voice? Where are you going to use that voice? Chances are most of you here are only one person. I don't see anybody in the audience that is multiple people. So you have limited bandwidth, right? Like, you're one human. You can't possibly do everything you want to do as hard as you try. And I know community managers always try to do more than they can. So this is very important. Social posts are pretty much a given. You're going to be doing that. But within that, where are you going to focus your social efforts? I mean, there's the big four that we generally tend to focus on. But even within that, what type of content are you going to be focusing on? Is it going to be content teases, behind the scenes content? Like, are you going to show a gray block of a level in development, or like Skate is doing right now? You know, they're showing alpha footage where it's just an absolute shit show, but it's fantastic because it shows players games don't come out, you know, fully born when they play them. Like, a lot of players think the game is being made and it looks fantastic the whole way through. It doesn't. Game dev is chaos, and we all know that. Are you going to focus on memes and shit posting? Maybe that works for your audience. But it's important to figure out where you're going to, you know, put your efforts. Are you going to focus your time on streaming? Is that important to you in your studio? Do you want that instant one-to-one feedback loop? Do you want to focus more on one-to-one engagement, something like a Discord or a publisher or a Steam forum where, you know, you can have that direct back and forth, you know, nearly instantly? And then there's the option of some, you know, stuff like blog posts and something kind of more distanced. Ultimately, this is decided by you as a community manager, but use the knowledge of what your community engages with best. Again, you threw spaghetti at a bunch of walls, focus on the walls where the spaghetti has stuck. But how? How do I balance all of this? I have to give people a reason to engage. I have to build trust and connection with my players. I have to stay authentic to this voice that we just defined. And I have to hit marketing beats and KPIs. We all have KPIs. We probably don't like them at the end of the day, because to me, I think connection and trust with players is more important than likes and retweets. That's kind of a hard sell to leadership, but we do still have to hit those KPIs. So how do we actually keep it real? I can only speak from my experience, obviously, so this is what I did to succeed personally. So for Insurgency Sandstorm, we started by defining the audience. For Sandstorm, we knew ahead of time, we had a player base already, and we knew that our player base was 95% and above male. They were largely 21 and above, skewing even older, like 30s to 40s, and they obviously loved military simulators. How did that translate to me? What does that mean to me when I'm trying to make these choices? They're very fixated on detail and accuracy. They can be quite contrarian and combative. And honestly, they can be slow to accept change. Now, a portion of this people leaned a certain way politically, which made it tough for me. But knowing that also helped me make decisions on how I was going to approach content and how I was going to approach the community as a whole. So what did we actually do with that information? How did we communicate, and what was our tone of voice? So like I said, they could be quite combative, and that's honestly a nice way of putting it when giving feedback. But to me, that meant I'm going to stick with a formal tone. I'm going to be matter of fact when I'm talking to them, because the way that they operate, we had to know our stuff. Milsim lovers can smell fear, and it's terrifying. So you have to be matter of fact with them, because that's what they respond to. The flip side of that coin, I mean, the game's called Insurgency, right? Like, it's very serious subject matter. I didn't want to fall into a hole where we ended up being too self-serious or taking ourselves, you know, too seriously, because at the end of the day, it's a video game, right? We're here to have fun. So I did want to keep a nice level of humor. I found that very important. And again, players who took the game very seriously, I chose to be irreverent. We had a lot of bullheaded players. They take the game and most other things in their life very seriously, and trying to combat stubbornness with stubbornness doesn't work. So I chose to be irreverent. And the reason that these three choices kind of worked is it's my personality, it's the voice that I chose, and And I chose to live in that voice in my time with Sandstorm. So the longer that you're living in it, the longer your community realizes, hey, like this is actually the community manager. This is how they actually operate. So what about our focus for platforms and now using that voice that we've chosen? We started everywhere. We threw, again, the spaghetti wall analogy is getting a bit old, but I'm going to stick with it. We threw spaghetti at every possible wall in the beginning. And we tracked engagement, and we kind of looked where the engagement was higher, on which platforms, which mediums had lower toxicity, and believe me, that's very relative. But also which spaghetti walls had higher amounts of actionable feedback. For us, this ended up being Twitter, Twitch, blogs, and surveys. And I do want to give a special shout out to surveys. If you need to gather data, surveys are fantastic because your players want to give you feedback. And if you give them a link where they can just type it in, they can click A, B, C, or D, they will do it. And at the end of the day, you have black and white actionable data. And on top of that, you have word clouds. And if anybody doesn't know what a word cloud is, it's like if we asked, what type of weapon skins do you want? And it's just an open form question. The words that are typed most are bigger in the word cloud. So we would end up with a word cloud, and for some reason, the biggest word would be anime. And anyway, so with context, it turns out everyone would write, please no anime, not anime, anything but fucking anime. But we still had that word cloud that gave us actionable data on what to do. So now we have a bunch of data and feedback, and we can start to act on it. From start to finish, what did I learn? What is important, and how did I stay genuine and authentic? That's a great question. I can't give you a black and white answer, obviously, because this only applies to my experience with Sandstorm. Community management is going to be different day to day for everyone, but I will do my best to kind of boil it down into some dot points here, and hopefully it helps some of you. So you have to start somewhere. I think the number one concern that players have is that they want to be heard. Assure them that you're listening. Tell them that you're hearing them. Let them know that your ears are open and your words are entering your ears. Then go back to the beginning and tell them that you're listening. Just keep hammering that home. That's kind of the number one thing, is they want to be heard and they want to know that they're being heard. I think it's helpful to be transparent about development cycles. My approach to community management was very transparent, and I know this won't work for every studio, but if you tell a player, we heard your feedback about feature X, and then you explain the process, that goes from feedback, the feedback goes to the team, a decision is made, that feature is prototyped, that feature is tested, then it goes through QA, and then it actually gets released. When they learn that whole process, you're going to blow their damn minds. Because, again, players don't often understand the whole cycle of development. It's really, we all know, it's not easy. Players don't usually know that. If you miss the mark, let them know. Like, your team is going to mess up. I don't mean you specifically, but as a team, mistakes will be made. Don't necessarily apologize, but again, assure you're hearing the feedback. When I was working on Sandstorm, somebody at our publisher decided that we should release cosmetics for Lunar New Year. Insurgency Sandstorm, as I'm sure you can gather by the key art you saw and the name of the game, Lunar New Year and Insurgency Sandstorm don't really mesh really well together. So I did a developer live stream to release this content, and I have never seen a more wretched hive of scum and villainy seeing those skins for the first time. But that's okay, because what I did was I gathered that information, I went on Reddit, I put on a biohazard suit, and I went into the Steam forums, and I wrote down manually the number of positive comments, negative comments, and I took that information and I brought it to our publishers, and I said, 98% of comments are negative, like our players do not want this. And we actually didn't release that content. And that looking back, like that's kind of a miracle. Like, we lost money by not releasing that content. But because of that, the community knew that we were listening. And again, I can't say it enough. Assure them that you're listening. And when you prove you're listening, say so. Always remember your voice. You set this tone in the beginning, so you have to stay true to it. That sounds really goddamn cheesy when I say it out loud, but stay true to yourself and what you're setting out to do. Amplify your advocates. So to me, it's often easier to reinforce good behavior than it is to punish bad behavior. Now, I'm not saying don't ban the racists. Ban every racist always. Like, that's not a question. But we always have players who know where that ban hammer comes down. And where they live is 2 centimeters outside of that area of effect. And they know that, and they live like that. So instead of exhausting your energy on them, amplify your advocates and celebrate the positivity. And what that leads into is show, don't just tell. You might remember a couple minutes ago I mentioned just once to assure players that you're listening. Now you have to prove it. Now you have to show them that you're listening. If a player reported bug is fixed, 100% that makes the patch notes. If it's in a hotfix, you make sure that hotfix is tweeted about and mentioned. And even more valuable than that is if community feedback ends up turning into content, make sure to highlight that. Like if you're hearing all the time, we really wanted you to add the M16A4, even if that's already in development, when it's released, say, this was a fantastic community idea. We are so glad you guys came up with the idea for the M16. We're happy to introduce it to you all. When I worked on Sandstorm, me and the head of production came up with an idea. So our release cadence was, we had our major releases, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 quarterly. And me and the head of production came up with the idea that we would do minor releases at the same cadence, but in between our major releases. And what those were obviously bug fixes, quality of life improvements, and then we would pick a few small community requested features that weren't big on dev cost, but we would work them in, and having these minor releases in between major releases went a very long way in proving that we were listening to the community. Be honest whenever you can. This is kind of a tough one, and again, it depends on the studio. It depends on what your leadership wants you to talk about. But I think there's value sometimes in saying, you're requesting feature X, but here's why we think that doesn't work. It will break feature Y. Context is just so fantastic. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Reassure them that you're listening. And again, never forget that voice. Stay true to what you're setting out to do. To be genuine, to appear genuine, you have to be genuine. And I know that constant feedback from 100 different directions, from thousands of players, can be very disheartening, but you have to stick to what you came to do. This is the tough shit. This is what players won't see. Like I said, if you want to appear real, if you want to appear authentic, you have to be authentic. So to do that, you have to fight for your community. You have to fight tooth and nail for your players and what they're asking for, within reason. But you have to do that. You have to take that feedback to your team. You have to escalate the issues. If you're seeing a bug constantly, but production doesn't seem it's that important, keep pushing it. Escalate that JIRA ticket until someone is working on it. Get behind content and features that the community wants, as long as it aligns with the vision of the game. This is behind the scenes, and players probably aren't going to see this, but this is a big part of the job, is actually advocating for those players. Annoy your team. Piss off the producers by giving them the same information day in, day out. They know, hopefully, that your heart is in the right place and why you're bringing them this information. So just keep fighting for your community. trust the process. The feedback to the feature cycle takes time. You know that. Hopefully you've been able to explain that to your community. But at some point, you do have to just put trust in this process that these things will happen. And for community managers, know when to walk away. It's a great job. I love it. It's a shit job and I hate it. It is so hard on days when the toxicity is just overwhelming. It'll probably get to you at some point. I almost guarantee there will be a day or two when you just can't handle it. And on those days, disconnect if you can. Turn off notifications. Stop doom scrolling for the day. To be able to do your job and to be able to do it authentically, you need to maintain a good work-life balance, which is extremely hard, especially when you're working from home. I understand that. But to do it well, to manage a community well, and to keep them happy, you need to be happy. Players can see that. That's it then. Some dude read some bullet points, and now I'm an authentic community manager, and the community is going to know exactly that I'm fighting for them, and how much I care, and how hard I work. No, they won't know that. That's sorry, but they won't know that. And it's the balance. It's that balance that is difficult. But remember why you were hired. Community managers are very prone to imposter syndrome. For example, I have no idea why I'm up here talking right now. I don't know why any of you came to listen to me talk. Fuck knows. But I'm glad you're here. We all suffer from imposter syndrome. But we are hired for a reason. Chances are most of you had an interview. It's likely that you had a few rounds of interviews. You haven't been fired yet. And you hopefully believe in what you're doing. So, remember why you were hired. You're capable. Do it. Utilize your skills, be yourself, and fight for both sides. Fight for your community, but also make sure that you're fighting for the studio. That information pipeline goes both ways, and it's important to remember you're acting as that firewall, and it's very tough, but you do need to fight for both sides. Be creative and have fun. It's noticeable and cheesy to say. It's a creative job, and if you're being creative and you're trying new things and having fun, it's noticeable to players. Players see that. And again, community management as a whole is so intangible, it's so ethereal and hard to measure that sometimes you get bogged down in just doing the same things over and over again because it worked. But keep trying new things, keep throwing spaghetti at the wall. And most importantly, to me, as a fellow ex-community manager, please take care of yourself. It is just a game at the end of the day. So here's the thing. What the fuck do I know? Who am I to say what's best for you and your team? Every game and studio is different. Every community is different. Every community manager is different. So what do I know? Likely not everything I've said will resonate with you. Hopefully a few things did. But I will leave you with 3 final dot points that I think are important, not only to community management, but to life in general. Always be learning. You're never going to know it all. You're never going to have heard every piece of feedback or every approach for engagement. So make sure you're always learning. Ask questions. Ask your community how they feel about things. Ask your team how they feel about things. Ask your peers how they feel about approaches. Ask your parents. I don't know, just ask questions. Questioning drives growth on a personal and professional level. And again, finally, try new things. Keep throwing spaghetti at the wall. Maybe you think a VTuber stream where you're rigged up as a lamb playing your game is a stupid idea. Maybe it is, but maybe your community secretly loves sheep, and you won't know that until you try it. So keep trying new things. I think I want to close by saying effort may not be measurable, but it is visible to players and to your team. That's it for me. I want to thank GCAP for having me this year. Like I said, I did not think when I submitted my outline that I would be chosen, and I have been on the edge of a panic attack for like 4 months waiting for this to happen. So thank you all very much for coming. I really do appreciate it. It's a weird idea to come listen to some dude talk about talking to other people. So I appreciate it very much. I think we've got a few minutes for questions and answers. So if anybody has anything they want to ask, come on up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. I think my key takeaway is the word cloud. That's just ingenious. Like, get people to write things in and then you know what kind of language they expect. It's great.
It's fantastic, yeah.
Yeah. So my question, I'm not sure if this is community management specifically, but it's in that vein of communicating with your audience. Where do you draw the line between communicating to your audience through obvious things like bug fixes, product feedback, all of the like very direct sort of questions?
Yep.
And when they're talking about subjects in line with what you're creating, because I feel there seems to be this pressure for a lot of especially independent creators to engage in conversations that the community is having between each other.
Right.
But maybe getting a little bit too involved in that, and that's sort of spiraling out of control. So do you have any experience or suggestions around that?
It's very dangerous. In that case, it's a pick your battles kind of situation, and it's definitely a case-by-case basis. I think if you have conversation X, we'll call it, if conversation X has nothing to do with what your vision of your game is, then it's probably not worth engaging. If that conversation is entirely toxic and negative, obviously don't engage that.
Yeah.
If you think it's a good idea, then it might be worth wading into those waters slowly at first and kind of, again, assuring them that you're listening and that you're hearing that feedback. And that will start a conversation loop, a feedback loop between you and your community, and you can kind of take it from there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I love the idea of surveys and collecting raw data from people. What are some practical survey tools? And probably more importantly for me, what's a good methodology for timing? When do you collect data? How can you collect it without feeling like you're data mining or saying the wrong tone?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So we used SurveyMonkey, which is a very easy to use platform. There's a free version, which is totally usable. Excuse me. And what we did, so we had in Insurgency, anytime we put out an update, we had kind of changeable banners right on the main page. So we would have a main image that would be like, link to the patch notes, here's the new update. And then under that would be like, oh, hey, by the way, we're also doing a player survey right now. And clicking that would just take them to the SurveyMonkey page, and they would fill that out, and it would just come directly to us. And we'd leave that open for 2 or 3 weeks, and it would give us, so for context, Sandstorm sits around the 3,000 Steam concurrent per day. But by the end of a survey period of 2 to 3 weeks, we'd have 20,000 entrants for data. And SurveyMonkey does a great job of collating it all. It's easily exportable. Obviously, multiple choice questions, very easy to read because it's just percentage of people that chose. If you leave something like, what color weapon skins do you want, again, you end up with a word cloud, which is fantastic and fun.
Is that a tool that SurveyMonkey generates for you?
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
they generate
absolutely.
Word clouds?
Yeah, so you can export to like CSV, and you can read through each individual color choice that people wrote in, but you can also just say, hey, I want to see a word cloud. And then blue is the biggest, so more people wanted blue than yellow, something like that.
And do you ever have to incentivize people to take a survey, or is it something that you can just do?
Yeah. We didn't. I'm only speaking from my experience, but I think the incentive to players is knowing that they're being heard, right? So for us, that was incentive enough.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Appreciate hearing your experience.
Thank you.
I'm curious about how you think about the lines between community engagement and support, like the standard customer support.
Yeah. That's very tough. Again, that largely depends on the size of the studio. So we were lucky enough at NWI to have one full-time support person, and we had a Zendesk set up. So I was active in our official Discord, and I would take feedback there, but if someone had, an official issue, we would send them to the Zendesk, they would open a ticket, and it would be looked at and dealt with that way. A smaller studio who isn't, lucky enough to have a dedicated support role, that's tough. Because as a community manager, chances are you don't have time to actively be doing support as well. But again, it just leads back to saying, I've heard your problem, I'll raise it with the team. And I think it's important to not overcommit. Like, you don't want to say, we'll fix it. It's important to kind of limit that conversation to saying, I'm sorry you're having this problem, we hear it, I'll escalate it to the team and we'll look into it, but just be careful not to say, we will fix it. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Anyone else? All right, one more. No rush, no rush. We have 6 minutes left, we're fine.
I've only just thought of this, so it might be a bit curly. Let's see how we go. You know the whole drama with Mass Effect 3?
Boy, do I.
Yeah. I feel like, as a community manager, sometimes I feel like we are approaching this sort of event where sometimes we listen too much.
Yep.
At what point do you, not cut your community off, but at what point do you decide, actually, like, we have enough feedback, we've listened to you guys enough, we're actually going to do what we think is best,
Right.
and take it forward from there?
So in my opinion, that's not a concrete point. That's an ongoing discussion that you're having. You're assuring them that you're listening, but you're not saying, we're going to action all the feedback that you're giving us. Because you're going to hear a lot of bullshit feedback that doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. So you're letting them know that you're listening, but obviously the feedback has to align with what you want to achieve. So it's kind of it's an ongoing thing. I don't think you ever want to tell a community we're done listening. I think that is probably not a great idea. But yeah, it's case by case basis. Like, we're listening, we're taking this on board, and when it makes sense with our vision, we'll try and act on it.
Hello, thanks for the speech.
No problem.
I feel like a lot of us have an issue with assets.
Yeah.
So just the assets aren't available,
Yep.
or they can't be shown to the public.
Yep.
I was wondering your strategy on that, because I know I'm having issues with writing copy
Yep.
for assets that don't exist yet.
Yeah, that's fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like I said, we had a quarterly release schedule, and I would write up kind of a communications plan for a 6 week period leading up to that release, and I would get dates from production on when we could actually reveal, and then working backwards, I would try and strategize ways of teasing. So, like, if we were introducing a new weapon, I know how crazy our community is about, like, real life guns. So I would talk to our sound producer and I'd say, hey, can I get, the sound of one bullet firing? And I would just release that sound with nothing else as a tease. So it's a matter of kind of working backwards and figuring out the best ways to tease your audience. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I got you on that.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
No worries. Matt Stafford from Mod.io.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm not a community manager, but I do a little bit for some personal work, and I'm
Yep.
curious. Obviously, not everyone who plays your game engages with that community in that
Yep.
area. So, how do you balance like the metrics of the number of players that you actually have,
Right.
versus the number of players that kind of engage in the community? 'Cause if it's a very vocal 1% or a very vocal 5% compared
Yeah.
to your player base, how do you balance those decisions and how they feed back into the team?
Yeah, that's tough. And I mean, the vocal minority is often extremely vocal. So, I mean, knowing that going into it, you just kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt. But the thing is if your other 90% of your player base aren't engaging, it's hard to get any feedback from them, so you can't really act on what they want. But again, I think surveys are fantastic for that, because people who are less likely to want to be publicly engaging are more willing to do something like a survey. Okay, I got time for one more.
I was going to say, you got 2 minutes. See if we can answer
Yeah.
this in 2 minutes. Communication strategy that you
Yes.
just talked about.
Yes.
High level, what does that look like when you're planning it out for 6 weeks, 6 months, or whatever time frame you mentioned? What does that look like?
So mine was straight up Google spreadsheet. And at the top would be launch day, and I would work backwards, and then kind of just, talking to production and art and knowing when things were available, and then working with our publisher of when we were allowed to talk about things, and also giving my input on when we should be talking about things, just working backwards and saying, like, I think the biggest draw for this update is this new weapon. So that should be one of the last things we reveal. So you're kind of leading from least important at the beginning of your marketing plan and building up the hype so that the biggest draws are kind of closest to release. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. No worries. All right, we are at time. So again, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go fucking breathe now. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.